Capitalism has become a dirty word in the United States of America. No longer is it seen as something that has made us better and different. Rather, it is viewed as the genesis of many of our problems, including poverty, inequality, environmental destruction, wars, climate change, and even interpersonal strife. Where did this idea of capitalism come from? Today, I am pleased to welcome one of the few people who is fighting against this narrative. He has written a book debunking myths of capitalism, and he has also done documentaries on subjects such as the Berlin Wall. We have a lot to talk about. Let's get into it. I'm Julie Hartman. This is Timeless. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Timeless, and thank you so much for being here. As a reminder, this Julie Hartman YouTube channel has a lot of content. On Mondays, we have Dennis and Julie, which is my show with Dennis Prager. That premieres at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. Then Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, we have Timeless episodes, also at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. And then throughout the week, I post these sporadic Julie Noted news videos where I profile a certain important news story or timely development that I think is important for you to know. So welcome back. And you can also follow me at Julie R. Hartman on Instagram and Twitter if you would just like more and more content than I am putting out there. As I mentioned, I have a great, fascinating guest today. His name is Dr. Reinier Zitelmann. Dr. Zitelmann is an entrepreneur and real estate investor. He was an editor and writer for Die Welt, a prominent German newspaper, and he has written a total of 27 books. His most recent book is In Defense of Capitalism, Debunking the Myths. Hello, Dr. Zitelmann. Thanks so much for coming onto Timeless.
Thank you for inviting me.
And I should mention to the audience that Dr. Zitelmann is in Germany right now, in Berlin, so it is quite late for him. But we'll have an interesting discussion that will be like coffee for you. It'll keep you awake and alert. So
Yes.
I appreciate your taking the time. So as mentioned, when you told me before the show that you did a documentary on the Berlin Wall, I thought, we'll scrap the capitalism conversation and talk about that. But your book is so interesting and so important that we will talk about both. Let's start with your new book, In Defense of Capitalism. It may seem like a stupid and obvious question, but unfortunately it is not so obvious to Americans nowadays. What is capitalism, and why is it, in your view, the best economic system to exist?
When I describe it very short, capitalism or free market economy means that consumers decide what is produced. Entrepreneurs decide, but in the end, it's consumers' choice. And on the contrary, or on the opposite, in a planned economy, politicians and government officials decide. And this is what's happening now all over the world, in Europe. I think also it starts now in the United States, that the government tells, for example, entrepreneurs who produce cars what kind of cars they should produce. In capitalism, it's consumers' choice. They decide whether they want to buy an electric vehicle or with a combustion engine. This is free market economy that consumers decide. And in a planned economy, the politicians make their decision because they think that they know it better than the ordinary people, the consumers. And this is something that happens now all over the world. I see it here in Germany, in Europe. They forbid now from 2030 on to produce cars with combustion engines. And I think similar things with the so-called Green New Deal from Joe Biden starts to happening now in the United States.
Mm. That's a great definition of capitalism because it highlights this hypocrisy on the part of the opponents of capitalism. Namely that many of these opponents wax eloquent about a system that is viable for the people, by the people, for the people. But as you just very eloquently said, capitalism is the system for the people. And then other alternatives, such as socialism, are the exact opposite. They're set by an elite, anointed few to impose their will on the rest of us.
Yes, I think capitalism is democracy in the economy. In a democratic system, we make our decisions in the elections all 4 or 5 years, and in the economy, we as a consumer, we make every day the decision who will become rich and who not. If you use Google, now it's now 25 years. Google, I think it was 3 days ago. You make Larry Page and Sergey Brin rich. If you buy something on Amazon, you make Jeff Bezos rich. And if you buy these products from Elon Musk, electric vehicles, you make him rich. If you buy Microsoft, or in former times you made Bill Gates rich. And no, it's our decision every day, and this is democracy. And it's not only that you can make all 4 years a decision, but you decide every day.
You know, what you just said, rich, that is another dirty word in addition to capitalism itself. And it's because we hear a lot in the United States about wealth inequality, the rich and the poor. And I think the American left has done a good job of conflating fighting wealth inequality with fighting poverty. That if you shorten or lessen the gap among the rich and the poor, then you're helping people escape poverty. Is that true? Or is it the case that we actually need a certain amount of inequality to A, raise people at the bottom, and B, provide the tax revenue to facilitate social services for those who are not as economically privileged?
You're absolutely right. These are two totally different questions. First, the question of inequality, and on the other hand, poverty. I will give you one example. Before capitalism, 200 years ago, 90% of the worldwide population lived in extreme poverty. 90% 200 years ago. Today, it's less than 9%. This is what capitalism did to reduce poverty. This happened every time when more capitalism is introduced, then poverty is reduced. Even in systems that are not quite capitalist system, but with some elements of capitalism. I'll give you one example: Vietnam. Vietnam was the poorest country in the world, 1990. First, there was the war, and what was not destroyed by the war was destroyed by the planned economy. The poorest country in the world, poorer than all African countries. But there are smart people in Vietnam. They started with free market reforms, with private property, allowing private property. They still call themselves socialist, and the party there, they call themselves communist. But I can guarantee you it's easier to find a Marxist in the United States or in Europe than in Vietnam, at a university in Vietnam. So, and what happened? The people who lived in poverty in Vietnam, the number was reduced from 80% to 5%. The same happened in China. What a lot of people don't know. In the end of the 50s, there happened the biggest socialist experiment in history. This was the so-called Great Leap Forward from Mao Zedong. 45 million people died in China as a result of this experiment. 45 million people, most people do not know about it. And even in 1981, 88% of people in China lived in extreme poverty. Then there was Deng Xiaoping. He started with free market reforms. They allowed private property. And what happened? The number of people living in poverty decreased from 88 to 1%. So why is this important? Because this means poverty is reduced. But of course, inequality is bigger today. I found no one. I was in Vietnam and I was in China and I spoke with the people. I found no one who told me, let's go back to Mao's time because we were more equal. Of course, people are more unequal today. You have as many billionaires in China as you have in the United States. But okay, people are not equal, but I think inequality is a topic for envious people. You know, if you see the so-called gap between the poor and the rich. It's two ways how someone can react. If you see someone who's better off, who has more money than you, then you have two possibilities how to react. First is the first reaction is let's expropriate, let's tax him higher, let's make life worse for the rich people, to reduce the gap between you and the rich by making the situation worse for the rich people. The other possibility is to think about how can I improve my own situation, and and you know I a last remark, because this topic is very, very important. There's a very famous anti-capitalist. His name is Thomas Piketty, a French economist. He wrote a book, The Capital in the 21st Century, and he said the really bad time in the world started in 1990, because starting with 1990, the gap between the rich and the poor becomes bigger and bigger. This is his point of view. I tell you another thing. In the 80s, 43% of the worldwide population lived in extreme poverty. Today it's less than 9%. So for me, it's a great time because poverty was reduced. For him, it's a bad time because there's more inequality. And I think we should make a decision whether we care about poverty or whether we care about inequality.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the increase in income inequality doesn't necessarily correlate with an increase in poverty. In fact, as you just said, with certain examples like China and Vietnam, it's actually the opposite. As we see some people getting richer, it doesn't mean that some are getting poorer. It means that people overall are raising their standards of living, or having their standards of living raised. I mean, I when I debate with people who are pro socialism, I say, if you went to someone in China in a rural village and you said to them, would you prefer to live the way that you are living now? Or would you prefer to live the way that you or your mother and father lived 45 years ago? And the answer is pretty obvious, even though there's still a lot of bleakness in countries that have adopted capitalism or capitalist methods. It is a huge improvement from the existing non-capitalist systems that preceded it. So before we move on from this to other myths, to close out this one, which is that inequality correlates with poverty, how does capitalism eliminate poverty?
It's very easy, by economic growth. I mentioned this, that the number of people living in poverty decreases in the same time. There are more and more very wealthy people, even billionaires. I mentioned this number, that the percentage of people living in poverty was reduced from 43% in the 80s to less than 9% today. In the same time, the number of billionaires increased from, in 2000, there were 500 billionaires all over the world. Today it's 2,700. So why is this important? Because anti-capitalists and all socialists, they believe in something that I call the zero-sum belief. Zero-sum belief means they believe that rich people become only rich because they took it away from the poor. But this is absolutely nonsense. You see, if at the same time the number of people living in poverty decreases and the number of billionaires increases, then it's not logical that rich people become only rich because they take it away from the poor. But this is a big misunderstanding that I call zero-sum belief. No, economic growth is this what matters. And this was even, Adam Smith, he had his, it was his 300th birthday 2 months ago. And even Adam Smith, in his famous book about the wealth of nations, he understood it, that the only way to reduce poverty is economic growth. I think it was very smart that he understood it even before before capitalism came really into existence. And the reality proved that he was right. I will give you another third example. This example is Poland, and I produced also a film about Poland. You can find it on for free on YouTube. It's Poland from Socialism to Prosperity. Poland from Socialism to Prosperity. If you Google it on YouTube, you can get it for free. And the story is like this. Poland was, in the 80s, one of the poorest countries in Europe. Very, very poor. Even much poorer than the Ukraine, for example. The GDP per capita was half of the Czech Republic. Very poor country. And then they started in 1990 with free market reforms, and people came out of poverty. Today, since 3 decades, Poland is Europe's growth champion. If you go there to Poland and you compare it with Berlin here, if you're in Warsaw, you will not see a huge difference. It's amazing what happened there. So capitalism is the best system against poverty. This is proved by history time and again. And on the other hand, there were 24 socialist experiments in the last century. They tried it in so many different ways. In the Soviet Union, in another way as in Yugoslavia. In North Korea, in another way as in Cuba, for example, or Romania in another way than in East Germany. But they have all one in common. Every socialist experiment failed without any exception. The situation of people wasn't improved one time. But the problem is, if you tell this to socialists, they will tell you, oh, wait a moment, this is no argument because this wasn't true socialism. They tell you what is true socialism. And the last experiment happened in Venezuela. Let's add only last thing, something about Venezuela. In 1970, Venezuela was one of the 20 richest countries in the world. One of the 20 richest countries. Then they started with regulation, more regulation, less economic freedom, and the situation became bad. And then people in Venezuela made a big mistake. In the end of the 90s, they voted for Hugo Chavez, for a socialist. And he promised everything will become better. In the first years, things became better because he had good luck that oil prices were 10 times higher 2 years after he came to power. But then he started with all these crazy things like nationalization, and it's a disaster. The inflation rate in Venezuela some years ago was 1,000,000% the year. 10% of the population fled. People live in poverty there, and they abolished the freedom of press, freedom of speech. They abolished democracy. This is what happened all the time. And now what is important? When Hugo Chavez came to power in the end of the 90s, the anti-capitalists, the intellectuals in the United States and in Europe were so enthusiastic. They called it the socialism of the 21st century. The socialism of the 21st century. They were so happy that they had now a new role model, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, because North Korea didn't seem so attractive for a lot of people. And so they praised him. Hugo Chavez, he's great, he will fight poverty. And then when this experiment failed, as every other experiment failed in the last century, what did they tell you then today? Oh, no, sorry, this wasn't real socialism, but next time it will be better. And this is the same old story that they tell us now since more than 100 years.
Yeah. Well, as you very well know, no matter how much evidence there is to the contrary of many of these individuals' opinions, they will never concede that there is evidence to the contrary. And in addition, they will make gratuitous assertions which have no evidence for their validity. One of them that you talk about in your book is that capitalism undermines democracy. Can you please tell us how that argument goes? Why are people saying that capitalism undermines democracy, and what your response is?
Yes, what they tell you, that in capitalism, the rich people decide whose president or who will rule. And of course, if I would speak about Europe or Germany, this is absolutely ridiculous. No, I think things here would be much better if it would be true and rich people rule. But I think no one would say it for Germany or for Europe. But let's talk about the United States. Yes, it's true that you can't become president without raising money, but it's not so easy that the more money one has, that it's a guarantee for political power. I give you one example. As of 2016, not one of the 100 Fortune 100 CEOs donated for Donald Trump. Later, he raised money, a lot of money, 600 million, but Hillary raised twice as much, Hillary Clinton, 1.2 billion. But who won? Donald Trump, not Hillary Clinton. So if it would be only about money, he could never become president. And even a better example is Joe Biden would never become president of the United States if it was about who has the most money. But the president today, his name would be Michael Bloomberg, because Michael Bloomberg, he tried to run for president for the Democratic Party. And at this time, he was the 8th richest man in the world with a net worth of 62 billion. 62 billion, and he spent 1 billion in only 3 months. And there was no one, never in history, who spent so much money, but without any effect. Joe Biden, who's really poor if you compare him with Michael Bloomberg, became president. So it's not so easy. And I have a lot of facts like this in this book. There are, you read it, there are a lot of other chapters, for example, about what anti-capitalists claim, that capitalism is to blame for environmental destruction and climate change and all these things. I wrote this book not to convince anti-capitalists, because I know they will not read this book. They prefer to read book number 35, Why Capitalism is Evil. For example, Bernie Sanders has now a new book out, Why It's Okay to be Angry About Capitalism. No, they will not read the book. I know it. If I post it on internet, here's the book In Defense of Capitalism. Sometimes I post it on Twitter, on the internet, and I got some comments from left-leaning people, anti-capitalists. This is all crazy. It's all wrong. It's all... And then my question already asked, have you read the book? No, I would never read a book like this. So they will not read the book. I wrote the book for people like you, hopefully a lot of people who listen to us who are pro-free market economy, but to support you with all the evidence, with all the facts. You see, in the bibliography, I used 360 books and scientific papers to write this book. And I did a lot of research. Not everyone has the time to do things like this. So you find all the arguments that you need if you have a discussion with anti-capitalists. And I think it's important, because these anti-capitalists, they are not the problem. The problem is that there are not enough people to stand up for capitalism, to defend capitalism. This is the problem.
Isn't that amazing? Because we are all the beneficiaries of capitalism, and the people who tear down capitalism are scorning the steps by which they ascended. It's the same time when people are anti-free speech. They're using free speech to tear down free speech and to want to suspend it for other people. It's the ultimate sick irony. Before we continue with Dr. Zeidelman, I want to...
Sorry, it's an important point that you made, because it was the same. I come from Germany, and in the 30s, Adolf Hitler said, we will fight against democracy with the means and methods of democracy. Yep. This is a problem.
Yep. I want to talk to you about your experience in Germany and your documentary. But first, I'd like to tell all of you about MyPillow. One of the great things about capitalism is that it creates companies like this with so much variety in their products, such as the MyPillows, the Giza Dream bed sheets, the MyTowels, and the MySlippers, all of which yours truly uses and loves, and you can use it and love it too at a discount to boot with the promo code Hartman, which is my last name spelled Hartman. Right now, there is a sale sale specifically on the Giza Dream bed sheets. You can get 60% off of those sheets with the promo code Hartman. That comes with a 60-day money-back guarantee and a 10-year warranty. You'll get a set for as low as $39.99, which I am sure our capitalism expert would tell us is a deal. So go to mypillow.com and click on the radio listener square or call 1-800-566-6745 and use the promo code Hartman. That's my last name, spelled Hartman. Hartman, you would know this, Dr. Seidelman, is a German last name, but I think we dropped one of the N's. There's usually two N's.
Your name, by the way, sounds very German. A former girlfriend of mine, I was very much in love with her. Her name is Julie, like your name. Hartman is also a German name. Yes,
she must have been wonderful. All Julie. That's what I say whenever I meet a Julie. I go, "You must be so smart and beautiful and multi-talented." Now I'm curious why you broke up, but that will have to be another episode sometime soon. Let's talk about Germany. I want to follow up on that point that you just made. I can imagine that your experience growing up in post-war partition Germany, where literally one side was capitalist and the other side was the opposite, was socially planned economy, had an impact on your life's work of defending capitalism. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes, of course. We had the possibility to see how it works. Socialism and capitalism, this was not a theory for Germany, but this was a real-life experiment. Germany was divided after the Second World War, with East Germany controlled by the Russians, socialism, and West Germany, pro-United States, with capitalism. And in my film, Life Behind the Berlin Wall, you can Google it and get it for free on YouTube. In this film, I compare East and West Germany. I give you one example, or maybe I ask you a question. What do you guess how long you had to wait to get a car in East Germany in the 80s, to get a car? What do you guess how long did you have to wait?
Oh, gosh. A week? 2 weeks?
It was the shortest time, 12 years, and the longest time, 17 years. Wow. Between 12 and 17 years, you had to wait for a car. And what you got was the worst car in the world, the so-called Trabi, I think 25 horsepower, a very slow and bad car, very bad for the environment. In West Germany, you could go, as you can in the United States, to every shop, and you could buy a Mercedes or BMW or Volkswagen or whatever you can afford, and you get it in the afternoon. You can buy it, and you have money with you. You can even take it with you. And this was West Germany. And in East Germany, I have it in my film, between 12 and a half and 17 years. Or another example, even in the end of the 80s, 26% of people in East Germany had not their own toilet. They had to share the toilet with other people in a multi-family house. And only 16% had a telephone. And I don't speak about a smartphone. This wasn't invited at this time. No, I speak about a landline telephone. And it was only 16%, while in West Germany, 99% had a telephone. And why is it so important to compare it? Because, you see, it's the same country, the same people, the same history, the same language, the same culture, only a different economic system, as North Korea, South Korea. And the thing is, people, they always flee from socialism to capitalism.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And not the other way around. Or have you heard about people who fled from South Korea to North Korea? No. Have you heard about someone who wanted to go from Miami to Cuba, maybe for 2 weeks vacation? I don't know, but not to move there. It's also always that people vote with their feet. They go from socialism to capitalism. And why are these examples so important? You see, I speak a lot about history because I'm an historian. But what socialists do, they do something different. They compare their vision their utopia, a book with reality. And this is not fair. It would be the same if, for example, I don't know, may I ask, are you married or do you have a boyfriend or with you, for example?
Neither. For now.
Neither. Oh, that's good news. That's good news for me. Okay. No, but imagine someone has a wife and he comes home in the evening and she says, we have to talk about divorce. Why? Because she started to read romantic love novels about perfect love. Then she says to her husband, hey, I compared these love novels with our relationship, with our marriage, and it's not like this. So, and now I saw it's all is bad. I think everyone would say here it's crazy. You can't compare a love novel, a book, with a reality. You can only compare reality with reality, and this is what I do. I compare East-West Germany, for example, or Chile and Venezuela, or examples like this, and they compare their book, their vision with the reality, and I think this is not fair, but this is their trick.
Yes, good point. Speaking of knowing about reality, one of the reasons why I think this absurd anti-capitalism culture has emerged in the United States is that we are woefully unaware of the alternatives. We are so coddled and sheltered and swaddled in prosperity that we have no idea the way other people in non-capitalist societies live. Now, when you were growing up in West Berlin and when you moved to West Germany, I want to tell the audience that Dr. Zeidelman told me before the show that he moved to Berlin. Sorry, I think I said you grew up in West Germany and then moved to West Germany. I meant West Berlin. You moved to West Berlin about 5 years before the fall of the wall. Just wanted to clarify that I didn't read his mind. He told me that before the show. So you grew up in West Germany. You moved to West Berlin, and you and your fellow West Germans were probably not as unaware of the destitute situation of those who don't live under capitalism as we in America are, because you knew that across the wall or across the border there were people who were in a totally different situation. So my question for you is, did that have an impact, or were there people in West Germany, as there are in the United States, who still had this crazy idea that capitalism is this bigoted, terrible thing?
To be honest, yes, there were people. Even I have to admit, when I was young, as a teenager with 13 years, I was also I was a Maoist at this time. I thought China is the best because, of course, not East Germany, because we knew that it's bad. But China is so far away, and we had this propaganda how great it is there in China. And
where were you getting that propaganda? Forgive me for interrupting you. I'm so curious.
Yeah, there was a lot of propaganda. For example, when I was 13 years, they had a publishing house in German language from China, and every week there was a newspaper from China, and all these books with this communist ideology, and there was a lot of propaganda material. And so this is, if something is far away and you have never been there, then it's much easier to have some illusion how great it is there, and especially if you don't have different sources for your information, but if you have only one-sided like propaganda. And of course, I was young with 30, 40 years. I believe this stuff. So yes, there were even people, and the craziest thing is, even today there are people in my country, in Germany, who are, for example, pro expropriation of private property. We had this is a maybe crazy thing, but there was a voting in my city here. I live in Berlin, and I think 3 years ago, and 56% of the population voted for expropriating private housing companies. It's crazy because it didn't work in East Germany, and they should know it that it did not work. But the problem is, the longer the longer there's the time distance to socialism, people forget it. They forget it. In the 90s, everyone understood that socialism does not work and capitalism is the better system. In the 90s, there were politicians like Ronald Reagan, for me, the greatest president of the United States. I admire Ronald Reagan, or Maggie Thatcher in the UK. Even in China, they understood it. There was Deng Xiaoping, who started with his free market reforms. Today, 30 years later, people forget it. With the time distance. In China, it's the same problem. They had a lot of progress with introducing private property, and now this Xi Jinping goes back in the direction of less market, more plan. You do it in the United States. I can tell you one fact that's maybe shocking for you. Half year ago, the new Index of Economic Freedom from the Heritage Foundation in the United States was published. This is an index that compare all countries all over the world, how economically free are these countries. 180 countries. The freest countries are Switzerland or Singapore, and in the end, you have at the bottom you have North Korea and Venezuela and Cuba. And now the bad news for the United States. They created this index in 1995, and this year was the worst ranking for the United States since they started with the index. The United States are today only number 25 from the economic free countries. Sweden, for example, is number 10. Sweden is much more capitalist today than the United States. And according to this ranking, there are even 16 European countries that are more economically free than the United States. And this doesn't mean that things are great here in Europe. On the contrary, we also go more and more in the direction of a planned economy. So you see, it's like this anti-capitalism is like a virus, much more dangerous as the COVID virus was. And I heard before we started, I heard your other show, and you spoke about this crazy gender ideology and woke ideology. This is the same. Yeah. This is also like a virus. It's not only happening in the United States. We have it here also in Germany, a lot of this stuff. And even, I traveled last year to 17 countries and this year 15 countries. So in total, I've been in 32 countries all over the world, last year, this year. So I can compare it. And even in Latin America, there's also this anti-capitalism, of course, in Latin America, but even this woke ideology and this crazy gender ideology, I thought this is only something that happens in Europe and the United States. No, it's also in Chile, it's in Argentina, it's in Brazil. You can't believe it. It's like a virus, and the same with anti-capitalism. So it's a global problem, not only a problem in one country.
Mm-hmm. This discussion of proximity to these realities is interesting, and you say that the further away you are from it, the more that you get this idea that capitalism may not be such a great thing, and that the socialist experiments far away from you may be a great thing. There's one example though, or there's one reality that I think kind of counters that view. The United States historically, certainly not now, but historically has been a defender of capitalism, and arguably one of the countries that is the most pro-capitalist. And socialism, again, up until recently, where the United States has become infected by this, it used to really be that socialism was in vogue in Europe. And that kind of perplexes me, because if we're going by the proximity argument, it doesn't makes sense to me that Europe would historically be the place that would experiment or flirt with socialism, because they are they were more proximate to, for instance, the Eastern European puppet states of the Soviet Union, where the socialist experiment utterly failed. So why do you think it is that historically the United States, despite being an ocean many, many miles away from socialism, was more pro-capitalist than these countries that were more proximate to the evil of a non-capitalist system?
Um, even today, this is the good news. People in America, in the United States, on average, are more pro-capitalism than most of the people all over the world. I can prove it with a poll. I commissioned a poll about the image of capitalism. It was the biggest poll ever done in the world. I commissioned it and I spent a lot of money for it. This is very expensive. I spent more than €500,000. This is the same as $500,000 to do this poll now in 35 countries. And we asked people a lot of questions, whether they like capitalism or the free market economy or not. The good news is the United States are still number 2. There's only one country where people are more pro-capitalism than the United States. This is Poland. But the United States is still number 2. And most of the other countries, especially European countries as France, Italy, Spain, Germany, the attitude of the people there is much more anti-capitalism here and of course it's hard to understand, as you mentioned it, that we should know it better in Europe because we saw that capitalism failed. But I gave you this example. This is what socialists always tell you. Oh no, this is not the real socialism. I have another idea, maybe as it is in China or like it was in Venezuela or whatever countries far away. Oh, in no country, only in a book, their utopia. So this is the real problem, that it's hard to argue against anti-capitalism with facts because it's not based on facts. It's like religion. I have the last chapter in my book. It's anti-capitalism as a political religion.
Yes.
And it's true. It's a kind of belief system, religion, and this is the problem. I was 2 months ago in Greece, in Athens, and there were two weeks before I've gone there was a terrible accident with a train. 50 people died, and of course capitalism was also blamed for this, as capitalism is blamed for everything. And I was there in my hotel, and there were protesters, communists with their red flags and this, and I saw them because they were close to my hotel, some thousands of people. And now what was important, half of the time they sang songs. I couldn't understand them because I don't know Greece, but these were very beautiful songs. Touch your heart. And then I said to my girlfriend, look here at these protesters. This is the problem. They have the emotions and I have only the facts. And this is the problem of anti-capitalists, that the problem of pro-capitalists, that the anti-capitalists are much better in marketing, in public relation, especially if it comes to emotion. We have to admit it. They are much better than we are, so we have to learn from them. We can't speak only, I gave you a lot of facts today, but I know the facts is the one thing, but we have to touch also the emotion. And this is the reason why I started to produce these films, because in a film, sometimes it's easier, to be a little bit more emotional than it is in a non-fiction book as I wrote. But these are only documentaries, but my dream would be, if I would have enough money one day, also to produce like a real film, a real movie, that's not only with facts and with arguments, but also to touch the emotions of the people, because this is the experience that I made very often. You can have the best facts, you can have the best arguments, but if someone is a true believer, it's hard to convince him.
Yes, you need the pathos, the emotion, as well as the logos, the logic. Your book
Yes,
has both. Your book has
exactly.
both, yes.
You need both. Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zeidelman, for being here. As a reminder, his book is In Defense of Capitalism, Debunking the Myths. And I love what you said, how this is a book really more for people who are defenders of capitalism than those who oppose it, because we need to be armed with facts as well as stories to make our claims, our position.
Thank you for this. May I correct one thing? What you showed now, yes, you showed now the UK version of the book,
Oh.
but this is the American version in the United States, In Defense of Capitalism. You have to know this book, and I'm very proud about it, is published in 30 countries all over the world. And I promised I was in every country where the book is published, even in South Korea or in Mongolia, everywhere. And but this is you find it, you can find it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, the American version of the book.
When you said that it's published in 30 countries, my response was going to be, and you've probably been to all of them, and then you confirmed it.
Yes, I go to all these countries. I speak about the book. I learn from people there, and it's amazing. It's a fascinating thing to travel to so many countries, and I can only do it because I was a very successful entrepreneur and investor, and I made a lot of money. And I spend it now for my research. I spend it for this traveling to countries and to promote the idea of capitalism.
Well, good for you. Thank you again for your time and, of course, for your work. And thank you all so much for being here. I'll see you soon. Take care.